Good evening. My name is Barkha Dutt, and you're watching the Mojo Story channel, our independent digital platform. On the program today, we are looking at what this day, today, 22nd October, signifies. It is a day that is being marked by India as a Black Day. Perhaps not many people know that it was on this day in 1947 that Pakistan, in effect, displayed its first act of war against India by sending tribesmen pushed by the Pakistani army across the border into Kashmir. This, therefore, perhaps for the first time, is being recognized as a Black Day, several days ahead of Pakistani propaganda that in fact pushes a very, very different narrative. On the program today, we are going to understand a little bit more of our history. Why is this day so important? Is there a paradigm shift in the fact that we're finally talking about it? Also, several important milestones, regiments can be actually traced back to the one-year-long war that erupted on the 22nd of October 1947 and then went on till the 31st of December 1948 when the ceasefire agreement was finally signed. Let me introduce on the program one by one a very distinguished panel. We're joined by Lieutenant General Ata Hasnain, who's of course been the General Officer Commanding of the 15 Corps in the Kashmir Valley. We're joined by Colonel Raina, who is the author of several very, very meaningful and deeply researched books on this time period. And we're also joined by Professor Amitabh Mattoo, who is a well-known academic and strategic affairs expert and is, of course, also a Kashmiri himself, as is Colonel Raina, and Amitabh is in Srinagar at this moment. So this is a very interesting conversation that we're about to have. And I'll start with you, General Hasnain, if I may, to talk a little bit about what this day is all about. There's brilliant archival footage that is actually available, and we're going to be playing some of those clips, how the troops were airlifted on the 27th, how the Instrument of Accession was signed by Maharaja Singh on the 26th of October. There's a lot to understand about this date. So I'll request you to start by putting this day today in context.
Thank you, Barkha. Thank you very much for having me on Mojo. I'll try and summarize it in very brief. 22nd of October is the day. Although the preparations from Pakistan had already begun in July, 10 Lashkars had been created. They knew they did not have an army, a regular army at that time, because the division of the British Indian Army was being undertaken at that time. They created the Lashkars out of the tribal militiamen and decided that at some stage they would have to use perhaps military action. And they chose the date 22nd of October before the winter would come in and launched them through the traditional route coming in from Muzaffarabad via Uri, Baramulla towards Srinagar. They had planned very well to capture the airfield so that the possibility of the Indian Army landing by air could be neutralized. However, the battles were fought very, very bravely by elements of the Jack State forces at Mohra, Uri, at Baramulla, and the Kabalis, and the tribal militia as it was called, got involved into the pillage of Uri, the pillage of Baramulla. There were some great acts of valor by the Kashmiri nationalists there, people like Mahmood Sharwani and people like that, who delayed the move of the Kabalis. And fortunate that from the 22nd of October, the tribals would have reached in perhaps 3 or 4 days' time, but they got delayed. And because of the delay, the Maharaja could be convinced to sign the Instrument of Accession on the 26th of October. And that's how the Indian Army landed at the Srinagar airfield on the 27th of October. Thereafter, Srinagar and Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir has been a part of India.
So you encapsulated that beautifully, General Hasnain. And, as you mentioned, on the 27th of October, we actually had the troops airlifted, and the Instrument of Accession was also born from this time period. But the fact that this is being marked as a Black Day, the significance of that, there we can see those brilliant shots, a slice of history as it were, on our screens. How do you see the significance of the fact that this is actually being recognized as a Black Day when for years we actually haven't seen this happening at all?
Barkha, that's a very good question. And the fact remains, it's a question of the battle of narratives. You spoke about narratives right at the beginning of your intervention. I would say for very long, India has really not seen the necessity of playing its narratives the correct way, of actually naming and focusing upon the villains of the piece. The villains of the piece were, of course, the Pakistani leadership and subsequently, of course, the Pakistani deep state. The decision taken at that time to go in and change the course of history by force, militarily. Otherwise, perhaps India may have agreed at some stage or the other to go in for what is called a plebiscite or possibly a democratic means. But the moment this happened militarily, it led to a tremendous loss of lives. Baramulla, for example, General Akbar Khan in his book talks about how a population of 11,000 was reduced to a population of 3,000. How many were killed during this 1 year and 3 months war? Not only that, it has triggered from then the 1965 war, the 71 war, the 89 to 2020, 31-year proxy war, the 1999 Kargil war. It's due to this that the Prime Minister one day spoke about 42,000 lives which have been lost in the last 31 years here. Therefore, obviously, 22nd of October has to be marked as the Black Day. And I'm glad that India is coming forward now and actually focusing upon this, telling the world who is the villain to the piece.
Okay, let me now open this up. There are lots of things that you've spoken about, and one of the interesting things, as you mentioned, General Hasnain, is the fact that though this was originally presented as an attack by Pashtun tribesmen, it was in fact a meticulously planned operation by the Pakistanis. It is known as Operation Gulmarg. You have, in the Raiders of Kashmir, the book, the Pakistani officer who led the operations, talking about meetings with the Pakistani Prime Minister at that time. So that was the level up to which it went. General Hasnain, before I bring in Colonel Raina and Professor Mattoo, would you say, I called it this, would you say this was in effect Pakistan's first proxy war? This is a term we've come to understand today. Today, terrorists are pushed in across the border. At that time, Pashtun tribesmen were pushed in. In some ways, this was Pakistan's first experiment with proxy wars in Kashmir.
Absolutely endorse what you say. Operation Gulmarg was the first proxy war. Operation Gibraltar was the second proxy war, attempted proxy war converted to conventional war in 1965. Operation Topak in 1989. Attempts to reverse that in 1999 in Kargil, where they actually tried to take ownership of their own troops going in as attempted mujahideen. So somewhere or the other, the connection has always been semi-regular, irregular involvement. Primarily, the Pakistanis have believed all these years that in 1947 they were unprepared. 1965 they felt they were weaker than India, and they always somehow felt that the Kashmiri population would always come to their support. They felt this in 47, they felt this in 65, they felt this in 89. 47, 65, they were miserably failed by the population of Kashmir. 1989, to an extent, the population of Kashmir did support them. But subsequently, today, I think the narrative has changed to a very, very great extent.
So we'll talk about the present day in a moment, but since you brought up, General Hasnain, the role of the local population, the role of civilian militias, I want Amitabh, Mattoo and Colonel Raina to come in on this, but there's some, absolutely brilliant images of that time of Kashmiri women. I think perhaps among the first group of women in independent India to actually wield rifles in battle. So, this is also one of the many untold stories of that time, of those tumultuous times, and local civilian militias alongside state forces really played a critical role at this time. Professor Mattoo, let me bring you in as we look at these very fascinating images on our screen. The significance of this day, and obviously today extremely perhaps politicized, but there's recorded history to talk about what happened at that time.
Barkha, this actually is a slice of my personal history as well as documented political history. Two of my aunts were part of the Women's Defense Corps.
Wow.
And they were trained in the use of firearms. It was led by Zuni Begum and Mahmood Ali Shah, who later became principal of the Women's College. But this was a popular civilian resistance against the Kabalis. And you had a people's militia in which a large number of people were killed, Pushkar Zadu, Somnath Behra, but also the famous case of Makbul Sherwani. So you actually had a popular resistance within the valley, which ensured that at 4 days, between 22nd of October and the army landing on the 27th of October, they were able to prevent the Kabalis from entering Srinagar, were able to. Maqbool Sherwani famously used his guile, his courage, his bravery, audacity to misguide the tribal invaders so that they were stopped at Shalteng. And then thereafter, the Indian army was able to repel the invaders at Shalteng in the famous Battle of Shalteng. But it's a tragedy of our times that someone like Maqbool Sherwani, who was all of 19 years old, who was killed, shot 14 times, and crucified. And his last words were supposed to be documented evidence, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Ittihad, Zindabad, that let the victory of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs always be there. He was a national conference worker from Baramulla and had this image of being a little Robin Hood. I mean, Margaret Bourke-White, the photographer, writer from Life magazine, has documented it extensively in her book. But so has Mulkraj Anand's written a book on Maqbool Sherwani. The tragedy is there's no award posthumously given to Sherwani. His public contribution to the manner in which he prevented the invaders from entering Srinagar is not recognized. So I think that moment in history was a moment when everyone had faith in Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs together fighting against the Kabalis. And what they did in Baramulla has been documented by Andrew Whitehead and others. The rape and pillage of St. Joseph's Convent, the nuns there. This is all recorded history, and I'm glad in some ways the Kashmiris and the rest of India is being told about what the Kashmiris did themselves during that period, because the rest of India needs to hear that as well at a time when you tend to demonize people. You've gone silent, Barkha. I can't hear you.
I think you've made a very important point about the fact that that someone like Mr. Sherwani was not recognized, that perhaps most Indians don't even know who he is, and the sense of this word anti-national that is labeled on Kashmiris, people forget how civilian local people actually stood as the bulwark against the Pakistanis, and I think that dovetails into a present day conversation that we need to have as well. So I just want you to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go to General Hasnain. We seem to keep losing Colonel Raina, but go ahead, Amitabh.
Barkha, I think it's an extremely important point when you try and club and demonize and declare all Kashmiris anti-national. You have to go back to that period in 1947. They were in the front line of your war against Pakistani-backed Kabalis. There was not a Kashmiri household, Pandit, Muslim, or Sikh, who was welcoming the Kabalis. And together, to a man, teenagers, women resisted that invasion. Maqbool Sherwani is the name, the symbolic name of that invasion, because he demonstrated that he could be martyred but never let go of the cause. But as I said, there were Kashmiri Pandit women from traditional middle-class households who joined the Women's Defense Corps. And frankly, and at a time when it's become fashionable to demonize people, even the contribution of Sheikh Abdullah. Yeah. I mean, Sheikh Abdullah was the person who helped coordinate this militia, and there was that famous slogan, Hindu Muslim, Sher Kashmir ka kya irshad, Hindu Muslim Sikh Ittihad, and the slogan which the civilian militia had coined, Hamlawar ho khabardar, hum Kashmiri hain tayyar. So I think to recover that tradition, if you're looking for the Sherwanis of today, people who will stand up for the ideals and who believed in the power of reconciliation and all faiths acting together, we have to recover that slice of history, strengthen it, and mainstream it. I think the story of Maqbool Sherwani should be told or should be read in every school, in every district, in every part of India. Because even in the army cantonment, which has this large board of Maqbool Sherwani, it says, here was Kashmir's Bhagat Singh. Because as important was Bhagat Singh to the freedom struggle, Maqbool Sherwani was to the idea of India in Kashmir. So he needs to be lionized with as much effort as has been done in the case, deservedly, of Bhagat Singh.
I think that's a really beautiful point, and we will get from the history to how the history can teach us a lesson or two about the present. But before we lose Colonel Raina again, let me just at least get a few quick words from him. Colonel Raina, go ahead. You've studied this time period very closely. I want
Yeah,
you to talk about the significance of this day, sir, and how it's being marked and recognized. Go ahead, sir.
yeah. Barkha, thank you, Barkha, for such a good meeting. We trekked about 5 kilometers to come down to a cyber cafe to be with you. I'm sitting at a very remote
Thank
place
you.
as on today. We can
Thank
make
you.
out.
Thank you for the
Uh,
effort. That's why I think our audience will understand your
no,
weak
it's a privilege.
bandwidth at the moment. Go ahead, sir. Please talk about this
Yeah,
moment.
yeah, it's a
Yes.
privilege. Yeah, okay. Barkha, I'm a student of military history. So I'll talk in very, I have a different perspective too. Firstly, there's nothing which you can take away from Kashmiri locals. They proved it in 47, they proved it in 65. The most peaceful territory when in rest of India, rest of Punjab was burning just next to J&K. Kashmir was the, example to follow. Now, when we talk of this 22nd October and things which happened thereafter, we also tend to forget that two, three things are very interesting to tell you. The first invasion of the state actually happened on 8th of October, night 8th and 9th. Now, not many people know it. 8th and 9th October, there was a Gurkha platoon in a place called Avan Patan. Avan Patan is in Punch. In fact, when the signal went from Pakistan 7 headquarters 7 division, people were it was intercepted and nobody knew where was Avan Patan. Neither people in Delhi nor even in Pakistan. So that is the first locality which fell on night of 8th and 9th October. Before that, I'm not counting, there were raids happening right from 15th August. Like I think General Hasnain was trying to bring out. The proxy had started much before that. General service plan, Gulmarg, everything was happening. But on that day, that night, they came and for the first time, they sat on our territory. Thereafter, over next 10 days, things went really out of hand in Punch. You will be surprised to know that while 6 Lashkars, that is 6,000 people, came to Kashmir Valley, and their aim being, of course, plundering, if possible, capturing airport and capturing Maharaja Hari Singh alive, so as to make him to sign the Instrument of Accession. That was one part. However, against 6 Lashkars in Kashmir, there were 10 Lashkars which were pitched against Punch and Mirpur. And that part of history just gone missing. Pakistan 7 Infantry Division was sitting behind those Lashkars. There was a brigade posting against in front of Jammu in Sialkot. So finally, on 19th of October, there's a place called Proxy Fort in Punch. That is the place another massacre happened. And see, Punch, I also belong to Punch, by the way. I am not a classical Kashmiri. Punch had contributed about 60,000 soldiers to British Army during World War II. Supposed to be very battle-hardened, tough fighters. The Pakistan proxy war, first part of it was uh, misleading these people and convincing them that their future lies with Pakistan. So these people, they were trying to, this larger picture is that they were not really raping or killing Hindus or Sikhs in Punch. What were they doing? They were only creating a kind of threat, which happened again in 87 also. Because of that threat, 9 Jack Reef was one battalion of state forces, because at that time it's called 9 Jack Infantry. It was a move to Punch. It moved from Valley to Punch. Valley was left with one single battalion called 4 Jack Reef. 4 Jack Reef was deployed at Muzaffarabad, 2 mil. The first two companies, we were sitting at a place called Lohara Port. Now I'm getting into a bit of geography, basically to understand that on the international border, the companies which were supposed to be protecting our state on 21st, 22nd night, those companies somehow crossed over to the people who were coming from other side. On 22nd, Muzaffarabad was badly, and it was not Hindu Muslim Sikh issue. Everybody they found, they plundered, they raped on the females on the streets of Muzaffarabad. Thereafter, Colonel Narayan Singh, who was your Jakarif, who had been sounded some kind of alarm by the headquarters of state forces that something's brewing up among the ranks. He had a lot of confidence in troops. So he died by the end of 22nd October. Thereafter, of course, like all of us know, Brigadier Jinder Singh rushed and things happened. 27th, he also ultimately died in
So thank you, sir, for telling us that story. And you are right that actually Maharaja Hari Singh, at the helm of the princely state then of Jammu and Kashmir, actually had fires burning in the Poonch area, and there was a standstill agreement. I think what people don't know is that at the time there was a standstill agreement, which means that Jammu and Kashmir had not acceded to either India or Pakistan, and Pakistan's attack. An invasion, therefore, was in complete violation of this standstill agreement. And it was 4 days later that actually Maharaja Hari Singh then signs what we now know as the Instrument of Accession. Now, Colonel Raina, as he said, is in a remote area, but I want to just get General Hasnain and Amitabh to react to. He, of course, laid out the military history. Let's dovetail it into what's happening in the present, sir. If you will. Amitabh, I think, made an important point about the recognition, to recognize the role that the local Kashmiris played. If you would speak a little more about that, sir. One second, sir. Just give me a second. 1 second, sir. Go ahead, sir. Just if you can repeat that point. Go ahead.
Yeah. Barkha, you've been to Baramulla a couple of times. I've commanded the Uri Brigade and the Baramulla Division. And I'm sure you would have come across the memorial of Maqbool Sharwani, for example, at Baramulla itself. It's a lovely community hall made by the Indian Army and the Sadbhavna. There's a memorial set put up for him there also, just like a memorial for the Sikh warriors, which is just outside Baramulla. So actually, Maqbool Sharwani was put on a pedestal by the Indian Army. But I think you are absolutely right that we did not do enough, perhaps, besides the army using its different networks there to try and put up this whole idea of the nationalist Kashmiri. I don't think we did enough to push up this concept, this whole perception that there were many people like Maqbool Sharwani, perhaps, who were fighting it out like this. For example, I would say the people in Uri, you had hundreds of volunteers who came to assist the army in its efforts towards Haji Pir. Most people are unaware that we fought for Haji Pir in 1947 also. We captured Haji Pir. We had to return Haji Pir because we couldn't keep it in winter. We had problems of winter equipment at that time. But for the capture of Haji Pir, for the capture of some well-known pickets such as Pir Kanthi, Ledwali Gali and places like that which were overlooking the Bagh Valley, it was the assistance of the people of Uri. We had no other means otherwise to take our stores there. There were no roads to take them up. We had hundreds of thousands of porters who came in and assisted us in doing all this. So these wars were fought by the Kashmiris. Again in 1965, if you see, Operation Gibraltar depended upon the rise of the Kashmiri population, the capture of the radio station in Srinagar, and the blurting out of the message from there that Kashmir belonged to Pakistan. But none of the population of Kashmir rose up in arms. They continued to show their complete loyalty towards India. So there have been many such cases all over, documented to some extent, locally quite well known. The army people know it quite well, soldiers know it, some academics know it. It needs to be put out to the rest of the country. And I think that's why this is a very important day today, this so-called Black Day, because there is a parallel program going on in the State of Kashmir Convention Center in Srinagar at this time, which has just been inaugurated by the Ministry of Culture. I'm glad at the highest level this has been taken cognizance of. And as we go along with more experience with people like Dr. Amitabh Mattoo out here, Colonel Raina, I'm sure we'll be able to do a great job of being able to project this to the rest of the world.
So one of the things, Amitabh, that I want you to speak about is the lessons that can be applied to the present day, right? For the sort of vitriolic times that we live in, and history has in fact moved quite dramatically, because that same Instrument of Accession that was signed on the 26th of October, born as it were, maybe partly at least from the Pakistani attack and the invasion of Kashmir, thereby accelerating perhaps Maharaja Hari Singh's decision on the standstill agreement. Now 370 is gone. Now 370 is actually gone. And there is a new political paradigm that is being created, and Maqbool Sharwani, a hero for Kashmir, is not somebody that India knows. And the National Conference and other parties would argue that we're all being demonized in the mainstream narrative. So if you had to take a lesson from history and apply it today, what would that lesson be?
In fact, I often talk about the three legacies of Maqbool Sherwani. But before that, I do want to repeat for your audience the one other slogan of the Peace Corps, of the militia in Kashmir, apart from Hamlavar, Khabardar, Hum Kashmiri Hain Tayyar. The other one was Kadam Kadam Badenge Hum, Mahaz Par Ladenge Hum. Mahaz is the front line on the border. Mahaz Par Ladenge Hum, Lutere और हमलावरों के साथ वतन फरोश बेवफा और कातलों के साथ. And here was a movement, Hindus, Muslims acting together, Sikhs, part of this resistance. And what Maqbool Sherwani represented is the willingness of a 19-year-old to die rather than to let his cause down, the cause of Hindu Muslim Sikh unity, the cause of believing in the idea of India. Now, what did Maqbool Sherwani's legacy today tell us? One, that there are people that you have to look and train and think, make people think in terms of the individual acts of bravery, which often get disregarded in history, but that you, for your cause, for what you believe in. There was no fuzziness with Maqbool Sherwani. Here is this young man with the audacity and courage that few people in India would have. Second is the idea of Maqbool Sherwani. Idea of Maqbool Sherwani was a rejection of the two-nation theory. He was someone who, when Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, visited Baramulla, he disrupted his rally. He was targeted by the Muslim conference workers, but Sherwani is documented as having disrupted Jinnah's rally, much to the chagrin of many others standing there. That is the idea of Maqbool Sherwani. But finally, what was Maqbool Sherwani's imagination, which Mulk Raj Anand brings out in his Death of a Hero? It is the imagination. After all communities are socially constructed. So you need to imagine before you can translate that into reality. The imagination was an anti-feudal, anti-monarchy, pro-people, and pro-democracy and for empowerment of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. So this is the kind of legacy that Maqbool Sherwani has left us with. And if we can collectively forget the politics, the partisan politics, forget the demonizing and the lionizing, if we can collectively, even now, work together to create this order in Kashmir and in Jammu and Kashmir, where every Kashmiri feels empowered, feels that there is real democracy, I think we'll pay the greatest tribute to the ideas of Maqbool Sherwani and all the people who have stood by India through thick and thin, which has been so ably documented by Lieutenant General Hasnain, whether it was Operation Gibraltar or in 1947, Gibraltar, the infiltration was first reported by the Kashmiris themselves. And Pakistan kept making a fundamental mistake, believing that there was an uprising which was going to happen once they sparked off that through either arms or through infiltration. That never happened. So we can't afford to let anyone down anymore.
I thank you for saying that, because I do think that lesson, that we must consider our policies and especially a policy of inclusion for those who have stood shoulder to shoulder with India, often at great price to their own lives. And that has continued to happen through the years of terrorism in the valley. Now, I want to, for my own understanding, because we were talking before the program, General Hasnain, and I'll come to you also, Colonel Raina, the story of the Jammu and Kashmir Light Infantry, the JACLI as it's called. Now, when I read about it, my understanding was that actually you can trace it back to civilian militia. That before, the Instrument of Accession was signed, there were, of course, the state forces, but there were also all of these militias that were drawn from civilians. And if you were to trace the history of the Jammu and Kashmir Light Infantry Regiment, General Hasnain, somewhere you would trace it back, in my understanding, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, to these moments. So I want you to talk a little bit about that. I know Colonel Raina disagrees, but let's just have that conversation. General Hasnain, please do go ahead.
Of course, someone as well-informed as Colonel Raina, I would never dispute him. He's a historian, a military historian. But my presence in the army, 67 years, I've always been studying different regiments of the army. And my knowledge tells me that the Jack LI actually came into being sometime only in 1972 when it got regularized. Before that, I remember lots and lots of postings used to be issued to Jack militia on deputation. It's sometime around 1970, 71, maybe early 72 that it got converted to a regular part of the Indian Army. And interestingly, even today, the accounting of money for accounts, for purposes of accounts, the Jack LI is considered under a different head and not under the regular head of the Indian Army. That's just aside for interest sake. But the fact remains that almost in case of all other regular regiments of the Indian Army, most of them came out of the state forces. There was a British Indian Army there, definitely, but there were many important units which existed as part of the state forces. The Punjab regiment has got this fantastic units like 15 Punjab, 16 Punjab, Nabha, Kal, and things like that, who came out of the state forces and merged here. Similarly, to my mind and information, the Jack LI also came out primarily from the state forces, and added to that were many of the elements who were involved in the fight against the Kabalis, who were, sort of latched on to the Jack militia, to the state forces, and gave assistance to them to fight against the Kabalis. Because the Indian Army was not large enough. The Indian Army had come in, 3 brigades were essentially fighting this whole battle. No, not more than that. And therefore, I think it was the classic role played by these troops. And probably Colonel Raina will be able to tell you much more about this because he has researched it in a much more comprehensive way.
So let me just bring in Colonel Raina, who's joining us on a slightly dodgy internet line. So if we lose him in the middle, we'll try and reconnect to him. Go ahead, Colonel Raina. The history of the regiments, I know you were saying that I haven't got that exactly right, so I do want to not make a mistake. But General Hasnain laid out a framework there, and maybe you could elaborate on it.
Firstly, General Hasnain, sir, you've been role model of many like me. I am nothing in front of you, sir. Having said that, Barkha, actually, in 47, the only troops which J&K forces had was J&K Infantry and some bodyguard units of state forces. The first person who raised what was to later come out as Jack Lai or Jack Militia, credit goes to Brigadier Usman in Nowshera. In Nowshera, Brigadier Usman raised a militia unit, and he had a band of young guys. In fact, I had the honor of meeting one of them, the survivors, even he's alive today. Those 14, 15, 16 years old boys, they were called Boy Scouts. Later on, many more joined in, many ex-servicemen, ladies in Nowshera, and they raised the first militia, unofficial, it had no name. They used to call it Ban Manus. Sorry, Ban Manus was the name given to first militia by Brigadier Usman, who was a hero of Nowshera. Second scouts were raised in Punch by Brigadier Pritam Singh, and they were called Punch Scouts. They were scouts raised in Ladakh, Leh Scouts. All these scouts later on, of course, from day one, they were part of the fighting with, along with the whether state forces were fighting, and later on army came in. Basically, militia came into existence after army landed, Indian army landed up. So they were part and parcel of our intelligence network. They were part and parcel of logistics network. And they are the people who, in 48, were finally converted into more formal set of things called J&K militia. As regards this home guard, the picture which is on screen, I don't know the reason, what are the reason, but despite all the bravery, all the courage and the josh they had to take on Pakistanis head on, instructions issued from Delhi were that NC cadre and Women Defence Force will not be taken along by Indian Army regular forces into operations. Whereas militia were always part of operations. They were working as couriers. And of course, General Hasnain is right. After 71 war and the job they did thereafter, in fact, for 18 long years, these units were deployed only along the line of control. They had probably the toughest terrain to
Very
serve
interesting.
And
Very, yeah. So that's very interesting. Now, what I want to do is actually we traced, there are not too many living accounts of that moment, people who were old enough at that point and who are still alive to tell us what happened, who were eyewitnesses to that moment. We did find a veteran of the army in Jammu. Major General Jambal, Govardhan Jambal, and we'll have the full story on our platform separately. But just to give you all of you a sense, I'm just going to play a little bit from his interview, and then we'll take last comments from all of you. This is one of the, I would say, maybe a couple of living accounts that still exists of an eyewitness to that time.
22 अक्टूबर 1947 को मैं श्रीनगर में था, लेफ्टिनेंट था मैं, ट्रेनिंग हो रही थी बदामी बाग कंटोनमेंट में। एकदम सुना कि कहीं पाकिस्तान ने मुजफ्फराबाद में अटैक कर दिया है कि रात 21-22 की रात को पाकिस्तान ने हमला कर दिया मुजफ्फराबाद पर। और बदकिस्मती ये हुई कि जो 4 जैक पलटन थी उसके कर्नल नारायण सिंह सीओ थे, उस पलटन में आधे मुस्लिम थे और आधे हिंदू सिख थे, डोगरा, सब डोगरा मुस्लिम थे, डोगरा नॉन मुस्लिम। डोगरा जो मुस्लिम थे उन्होंने तमाम नॉन मुस्लिम सिख हिंदू सब अपने रात को सोए हुए मार।
So this is another controversy, Amitabh, that questions in a way your feeling of that moment, that there was no religious barrier. So I just want your thoughts on that, that history, it was a very tumultuous time, we were just against being born as new nations on both sides.
Yes, there is obviously there's a period of great turbulence and tumult, and especially in the Jammu parts. But the valley, I think the remarkable thing which Colonel Raina pointed out was, and in fact, the father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, recognized that while there was communal carnage, particularly in Punjab, but also in Jammu, that the valley was completely quiet. There was not a single act or incident of communal violence, to the best of my reading of history. That so Mahatma Gandhi said that if there was a beacon of light that he saw anywhere, it was from the valley. And in fact, he at one of his prayer meetings after the martyrdom of Maqbool Sherwani said, this is the kind of martyrdom that any Hindu, Muslim or Sikh should be proud of. He lionized Maqbool Sherwani and he talked about the valley. Now, there might have been stray, isolated incidents in the valley, but none which have been documented to demonstrate that the narrative was deeply communal. In fact, the narrative was not communal. It may well be because the ideology of the National Conference had moved away from the initial communal roots to becoming much more left-wing under the influence of people like BPL Bedi and Freda Bedi and the lefties who had joined Sheikh Abdullah and produced the Naya Kashmir Manifesto, which was almost read like a manifesto of a Marxist party, called for land reforms, called for anti-feudal policies, called for separation of religion from any kind of affairs of the state. So certainly the memories, even within my family, of my aunts, but my uncle who General Hasnain knew, who was deputed in the Peace Corps, who was deputed in the militia in Kishtwar, all the memories that they had, Anupam Dhar, who's in the IAS later on, all the memories that they have are of amity, of resistance for a common cause, and no sense of great tension. Yes, there was obviously protection offered to the minorities by the majority community. So, for instance, the women from my mother's household went to Dr. Nasir's house and stayed there for a while to just in case there was a targeting on communal basis. But within the resistance, at least I can't. I'd like to be educated about whether there were scenes of communal clamor.
Yeah.
The fact is that Muslim Conference had its base primarily within the Mirwais in Srinagar, but really across the valley in Poonch and within the Sardars.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I just think that, this is obviously one memory of an individual, and it will be somewhere in the history books also that religious tensions also had to be managed. There was a Hindu Maharaja, a Sheikh Abdullah, a Muslim leader leading this. There were all kinds of things. There were the Dogras. So there were all kinds of things for Hari Singh as a king to have to manage. Now, concluding remarks, I'll go to Colonel Raina first, and then General Hasnain can have the last word. Colonel Raina, just, what is it that you think everybody should know about this period that you think Indians today don't know? And give me a second, I'm just going to unmute you. Yeah, go ahead, sir. Go ahead, sir. Sir, please unmute yourself and speak. Go ahead, sir. No, I'm not able to hear you, sir. Yeah, go ahead. Now I can. Go ahead.
Can you
sir.
hear me?
Go ahead.
Can you hear
yes,
me?
Yes, yes. Please go ahead.
Yeah. I'll just refer back to Professor Mattoo for a minute. Interestingly, this so-called mutiny by Muslim soldiers of Fort Jackal, which is a fact, did not have any Kashmiri in the rank. So as far as Kashmiri, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, whosoever Kashmiri title is concerned, they didn't revolt. The troops of Fort Jackal, the Muslim component, 50% of it, hailed from Punch. And Punch was, like I said earlier, had been targeted for months. So subversion had happened there. That's the reason that Kashmir rose to occasion in 47, they rose to occasion 65, despite whatever turmoil we've seen. So lesson drawn is that, if your path is right, if you're doing what is supposed to be done, whether it's for your nation or for your society or for amity, you will not go wrong. We have gone wrong. Let's confess it. From that era when Punjab was burning, part of Jammu was burning, and soldiers from Punjab were revolting against Maharaja's forces, being part of that force in as close to a place called Muzaffarabad, which is just on the fringes of Valley. There was still amity existed in Valley. So somewhere we lost the plot. I think we can't reboot so easily. But, yes, if you tell people what happened, who was Mahmood Sherwani, what National Conference Carter did, Indian Army eyes and ears were National Conference Carter 65, of course, all of us know. Even you come to Kargil, photos, Kargil war.
Yeah.
So J&K people, somehow nationalism is been our part of our life, our culture. Yes, things happen. Country and history is there to see. But I'm sure generation is waking up, and this 22nd as Black Day is a big beginning to let people understand.
Absolutely.
What was the right?
And I think we also have to remember that this was, partition had just taken place. There was carnage and riots that had taken place in many other parts of the country. And very important detail from Colonel Raina, General Hasnain, that no Kashmiri was actually mutinous. The Kashmiris were at the front line of this fight. I'm just going to give you the last word. A viewer comment. Of course, there's heated debate going on in the live stream, which I completely ignored. But this was because there are all kinds of ideologies at collision. But I think the most people would say what Tarun Kaushik is saying, that this is interesting. I never knew any of it. I never knew that there was this detailed history to the accession of Kashmir. So thank you for letting us know. And I think, General Hasnain, that is the point, that most people have no idea that all of this happened. And give me a second. Go ahead.
Thank you, Barkha, for the last word. There's no doubt that even in an organization so deeply committed to Kashmir, like the Indian Army, this information is not very well known. It's only people who have repeatedly served in Kashmir, perhaps, and who have got some kind of an interest in history, who have taken it upon themselves to educate themselves. But otherwise, formally, very little education has actually been imparted to soldiers, officers, otherwise, and I think it needs to be done. Colonel Raina, absolutely correct. I was about to say it if he had not said it, that for Jacarif, actually, the whole issue was Punch-based. And I also said this, that from July, when this whole movement was going on to try and do something in the valley, to do something in Jammu and Kashmir, this instigation was already probably taking place. There is no documented evidence to say it, but obviously no unit is going to have a problem of this kind unless an effort is made, focused effort is made to instigate the troops. I may also like to add, for information of everyone, the Indian Army has got a unit called 2nd Jackalai. It's called 2nd Jackalai Sherwani. I think a lot of people don't know it. In India, a lot of people in the army don't know it. In bracket, it is called Sherwani, 2nd Jackalai Sherwani. That's the title given to the unit. because honoring the memory of Maqbool Sharma. I think on that note, it's a very important aspect that we need to take this forward, and more people need to know about Kashmir, the nationalism towards India that the Kashmiris have actually depicted.
I think that is the perfect note to say thank you. I had absolutely no idea. So I've learned a lot by listening to all three of you today. Thank you so much, Colonel Raina, Professor Amitabh, Mattoo, and General Hasnain. I think the takeaway is that many more Indians need to know these stories, and they need to be, told, spread massively across our schools, our colleges, young people who may not even know anything about these years, even people like me who considers myself having studied quite a bit on Jammu and Kashmir, had no idea about this Sherwani unit. So that is a fascinating story. And I think the important point that we need to make today, learning from history about our present, is what you see on many of our channels, which is vilifying and slandering an entire Kashmiri population at large, is just plain wrong. And you need to look back to history, to the first proxy war by Pakistan on Kashmir. And the people at the front line were not just our soldiers, but were also the local Kashmiris, men and women, who stood there and were the first bulwark of resistance against Pakistan. So we will end on that note. Thank you very much, Colonel Raina. We just lost him right there. Professor Mattoo and General Hasnain. It has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Goodbye
very
to our
much.
audience, and we'll see you at 6 p.m. with a new program 15 minutes from now. Thank you. Thank you.